I love the title of this next presentation. It's true, spring is killing our Rocky Mountain snowpack. And to make that presentation is Greg Pederson. Greg is a research scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey at the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center in Bozeman, Montana. Greg's research has focused on changes in climate and the associated changes in snow, water resources, and ecosystems of Western North America. Dr. Pederson? Welcome to Mesa County.
Oh, thanks. It's nice to be here. Thanks again for having me, and I have to say it was a gorgeous drive down from Bozeman yesterday. It's actually one of the best road trips in the West if you get to take all the small roads up the west side of the ranges here, so I'd highly advise it. But I want to also say thanks to Eric because he gave a fantastic sort of geopolitical and policy history as well as river allocation history that will really underpin a lot of what I'll show in my talk. And what I'm going to be talking about are the primary drivers, sort of the climatically forced drivers, both over long and recent timescales. So we're talking about the past thousands of years to a focus on the past 100 years. And technical issues. So that's going to be the primary focus. And I want to mention two things about that. When I say the primary forcings of changes in snowpack, we are talking about the major changes that are causing and shifting the system in big ways. Now there's folks in this audience here like Chris Landry who study other extremely important processes that usually follow on the heels of a initially climatically forced process, like you melt out snowpack, you dry down your lower basins, and then you have lower landscape disturbance plus winds, which kicks up a lot of dust, causes dust on snow events, which then basically contribute to a feedback process that increasingly undercuts snowpack other than just the climatic events alone. So no model is perfect, whether it be a paleo model or a global climate model, but some models are useful. And what I'm presenting here are what I think are some very useful models of understanding the primary drivers of climate change. And I hope it's enlightening and also, again, in view of Eric's presentation, put some understanding of the magnitude of events that set up things like the 1922 Colorado River Water Compact. The last thing I'll mention too, though it's only my name on the title slide, the work I'm showing here is basically a summary of results from a very large number of people's work. And it's folks like Connie Woodhouse, which I'm sure many folks in this audience know. So I don't mean to at all diminish the contributions of other people. I'll throw up some title slides so you can see basically all the people who've contributed time, effort, and good thoughts. So I think all the ingenuity behind these studies, I'll say, comes from them, and I'll take blame for any excuses or any mistakes I may make while giving this presentation. So, hopping right in, again, leading through what we're going to do, we all experience climate through weather. That is, we get whipped around year to year from hot and cold years. So I think it's really nice to take a moment and summarize what's happened with global and regional temperatures and snowpack, because I think we have some really nice examples here of expectations from forecasted sort of climate events of the future. Then we'll hop into what many other studies have shown about documented 20th century snowpack decline. What's happened with recent warming across the West and how that links to things like changes in timing of plant leaf out, phenology, the melting of our glaciers, and then the consequent impacts on our water resources and how it's changing the dynamics on that front. Before I hop into a big part of this project, which is really summarizing the changes from tree ring records of the past millennium of snowpack variability throughout the Rockies, our highest, coldest basins in the Columbia, the Missouri, and the Upper Colorado. To both place our short modern record in a long-term context, and I think it has some really valuable lessons in those records for water managers and water resources as we think about how we're going to have to manage through a future that contains both natural variability of the climate system plus that human-forced greenhouse gas component where we're also living in a much warmer world, which has its own impacts and implications. And the last part, which was a focus on the paper we just published this year, it's really a companion to that paleo study, where for the 20th century, we really just pull apart the proximal causes of the snowpack declines, looking at both the role of temperature and precipitation and who's playing a big part of the story now versus early 20th century. And I think this is particularly enlightening when we start thinking about how snow dynamics and water resources are changing as we move into the future. So, without much ado, if we look at where we are today, basically 2012 had ranked up as the 9th warmest year globally, and it was actually the hottest year in U.S. history. It shattered records. I'm trying to get my laser pointer here to work. But if you look at the U.S., there's a huge area of incredible warmth across the U.S. and Greenland. And that had some real big effects in 2012. And it was actually, for a lot of us, the exact opposite of what happened in 2011. But what stands as the hottest year on record now is arguably 2010 globally. So when you look at the western U.S. in 2012, what you see is this huge area of warming, which really, except for the Pacific Northwest and the coast, there we go, I think. It's not showing up. The Pacific Northwest is cool and wet, and basically across central eastern Montana down through Colorado, you have basically temperatures running 8 to 15 degrees C above normal in the month of March. March is important because this is a big month where snow is accumulating, and we need temperatures to be cool for that snowpack that comes out of the snowfall to continue to accumulate. So if you look at what happened 2011, here's the snow cover. White areas on this map are showing you areas of high snow cover and deep snow depths, whereas blue is showing you low snow cover. 2011, it's cool, it's wet across the west, and you have high snow cover. 2012, the story is completely different, and we go from extreme flooding events, especially across the north with the rapid meltout that followed in 2011, to extreme drought and water issues in 2012. And I mention this because basically one of the largest factors in what happened between 2011 and 2012 was the role of temperature across the west. We had an extremely cool spring followed by an extremely hot and dry spring. And it just really changes the dynamic. So from here on, everything you're going to see in this talk more or less focuses on the interplay of these two things in driving this variability in snowpack and water resources. Also of interest, since we're in a big fruit growing region and we care about our fruit crops, basically 2012 also ranked as our earliest spring onset or leaf out of plants in the entire 20th century. This is work from some co-authors and friends of mine, and the epicenter of that early outbreak was across the Great Lakes region, with the Pacific Northwest again showing coolness. But what that set up was everything leafed out, but we still have a high probability of late season frost and cold events, which basically caused, we did get that, and it caused over $1 billion in crop damage in Michigan alone when their whole cherry crop was wiped out. In this map, the Grand Junction region of Colorado is kind of mixed. Whether or not you received damage then, I'm not sure, but it certainly shows damage extending down into the Colorado region. So there's big concern about how and why climate is changing and what happens when you remove snow early and start vegetation processes and then can have this sort of wallop of these natural extreme events like cold air outbreaks. So following on that, we'll hop into just a summary of a lot of our 20th century studies on how climate, temperature, and precip and snowpack has changed across the West. Basically, from 1950 to 2000, there's ample documentations of minimum temperatures warming faster than maximums. That is, our nights are warming more than our daytimes. And the greatest warming has been really focused across the Northwest and the Northern Rockies. And what's contributing to this is more or less both this mix of about 50% natural variability and 50% greenhouse gas-induced forcing, as near as the science can tell. Following on the footsteps of that recorded warming, we're seeing there's major declines in snowpack, especially across the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, and the Cascades, whereas the region we're in now, Colorado, has historically shown a more mixed response, where the low to mid elevations are showing 30 to 40% declines, but the higher elevations in some cases in some regions are at least staying level, and some are increasing in snowpack. And there's a reason for this that we'll get into in the paleo part of the talk. But just to summarize more or less what the scientific story is saying is that as temperatures are rising, especially temperatures in late winter, early spring, February, March, we're getting basically an undercutting or reduction in snowpack, which is leading to earlier peak flows and lower peak flows, and basically which sets us up to longer, drier summers with lower base flows. Now, this is particularly true again across the Northwest, but if you look at that snow melt pulse and timing for Colorado, there's a straight line across the bottom graph there. You know, Colorado hasn't shown as much movement as much as of the rest of the western U.S. has, which may sound surprising considering the current water woes. And again, there's a reason for that, which in part has a lot to do with how high the mountainous regions are in Colorado. And there, in a lot of ways, the snow mass is a lot less. It's further away from the 0 degree sea line, making it sort of less sensitive, or you have to warm much more before the temperature factor starts really cutting into that Colorado snowpack. And again, over the same period of time, we've seen this progression of about 8 to 10 days of spring onset across the western U.S., which equates to about 2 days a decade for most stations across the western North America. And again, when you do the parsing out of what the causation is of earlier spring onset, you get this mix of both natural factors like the El Nino Southern Oscillation and what's called the Pacific North American pattern, playing an amplifying role on top of sort of greenhouse gas-induced warming and causing this sort of rapid change across the western U.S., and particularly after 1980. There's almost a step change where we sit in a much earlier spring onset time of year. Oh, we got a laser. You know, can you guys see that? Because I don't see it from my perspective. Well, I'll just explain my way through it. But, you know, the glaciers really are a good canary in the coal mine because they reflect this balance between temperature and precip. To grow a glacier, you have to accumulate more snowpack than melts in the summer, and conversely, you have to melt more snow in the summer than accumulates in the winter to shrink a glacier. And when you look at what's happened to glaciers across the West since 1900, in permanent snow and ice fields, basically you see a ubiquitous decline, with places like Glacier National Park being the epicenter of this decline, with a 66% loss in glacial area, which is about 150 glaciers being reduced to 25, and a total loss of mass of over 80%. So, you know, even though snow is ephemeral and it's hard to watch the changes year to year, glaciers aren't. And we have these fantastic historic photo archives where you can just see how this is playing out with glaciers like the Boulder Glacier in Glacier Park in 1910 versus 2007. It's pretty much a extinct glacier, if they can be extinct. It's just an ice wedge today. And it's the same thing with the Sperry Glacier here in 1913. It's a pretty nice looking ice field, and by 2005, it's a pretty wimpy looking glacier snout as it retreats up the basin. So without much more time on these broad changes in the western U.S., we'll hop into the core part of the talk now, basically the unusual nature of our recent snowpack declines. And I say unusual because it is a complex story. And hopefully I can convey that without making your eyes cross too much in this next presentation. So just to give you a little glimpse of what we did, a a bunch of us who have been sampling trees in the western U.S. for a long, long time to get at hydrologic issues combined our records. And with the intent of reconstructing snowpack in our highest, coolest, and also most important water resource basins of the western U.S., so the Colorado, the Missouri, and the Columbia. And we did these for both the level 6 hydrologic units and also the entire basin, like the entire upper Colorado or the entire upper Columbia. So both scales of data are available, and they're all available online, so you can download any of this or even watch animations we put up of how snowpack has changed over the centuries. So, and I need to explain a little bit too about how trees tell us about snowpack. Basically, there's the obvious response. Most trees, especially across the south-southwest, see wintertime precipitation as a watering can effect. So the more winter precip and snowpack they get, the more they grow. But the counterintuitive part of how we sort of derived or got at snowpack was we also used a range of high elevation trees that see cold, snowy winters as a growth suppressant. So it's a negative forcing on these trees. And basically, between how much precipitation arrives and how long it sticks around, you can use these two biological responses to tell you something about snowpack. And I think it tells the story pretty well. And across the north, the trees that were incredibly important to be able to do that are things like subalpine larch. This is in interior British Columbia. They're a beautiful deciduous conifer. Growing at high elevations. This is one of our sites, Hazeldean Lake. This is Ole Lakes and the Cascades here in the fall as they turn gold before they drop their needles, which they're doing about right now. And then mountain hemlock across the Cascades was also a real big player in telling us a lot about snowpack in the Pacific Northwest. So basically, to show you how well the trees did, we go through a screening and calibration procedure where we then basically match the tree rings records that respond to snowpack to the observational record. And what you're looking at here is on the top graphic, that's the northern Rockies or upper Columbia. Bottom graphic is the upper Colorado. That dark black line is sort of a summary of our long-term snow course records that represent upper Colorado snowpack. And the light gray lines are the individual basin reconstructions of snowpack, and the orange line shows you more or less the entire upper Colorado snowpack reconstruction. And I hope what you can see here is the tree rings really do an amazing job of tracking that year-to-year variability and even that lower frequency variability, what we'd call decadal variability, that the blue lines are showing you. So I think they did a great job, and the great thing about tree rings is if we feel we can trust the observational period, we can then look back over the lifetime of these chronologies and trees to see what they say about the past. Now here's a slide that'll make your eyes cross. So it's the same arrangement, northern Rockies to the upper Colorado, and I'm usually focused on the northern Rockies, which again I've posited is most of that snow mass sits at lower elevations and is therefore also more sensitive to slight changes in temperatures. And across the northern Rockies, you see that decadal variability, which is that blue line, which is very prominent both in the northern Rockies and the upper Colorado. So we get a lot of this decade to decade variability, but there's also this low frequency wave. And that's that temperature effect. Here's the little ice age when all those glaciers grew to their maximum of the last 10,000 years, 1700s being an extremely high snowpack period. 20th century, even our best part of the 20th century in the northern Rockies looks more like the average for the past 800 years. You move down to Colorado and it just isn't the case, at least for the way we reconstructed snowpack and for the majority of the basin. You see here decadal variability dominates, so it's much higher, cooler mountain range, and we haven't yet seen any pernicious and distinctive sort of long-term decreases like you're seeing in the upper Columbia, even though you'll see some interesting dynamics really developing post-1980s. So you might wonder, how does that snowpack reconstruction compare to a separate reconstruction of the upper Colorado River Basin from Connie Woodhouse or Dave Miko? Well, more or less you can tell they're mirror images of each other for the most part. When you get high snowpack, you're getting high stream flow. There's your 1900s, up to the 1920s, when we allocated all that water in the Colorado River Basin, the lower basin states. Here's our big and sort of scary drought type scenarios for what would give a water manager heartburn. Things like the mega drought of the 1550s, the 1450s, and this 1100s drought, as Eric had mentioned previously. These are big issues for any society, even the prehistoric societies that were living there at this time. But the differences between these two graphs, I would posit, lie somewhere between uncertainty and basically the reconstructions in the models, but also the role that processes like sublimation, dust on snow, extreme summer drought conditions may play in amplifying either drought or wet events that you don't get in a snowpack record. But I'm not confident about that's what we're actually looking at, but it's certainly a process that plays out and we've watched play out over the 20th century. So the other thing that I thought was extremely interesting about these snowpack reconstructions that tells an important story is with the snowpack dipole. When I say dipole, I'm talking about the tendency during an El Nino or La Nina event for the north to either have a lot of precipitation and the south to be dry, or vice versa. So when it's an El Nino event, you guys typically get a lot of snow and precipitation, whereas things are really dry and the skiing is horrible across the northern regions, and vice versa when we're in a La Nina. And one thing that gave us confidence that what we actually managed to reconstruct was snowpack was the fact that for this 800-year period of common overlap between the regions, you see pretty much if you get a high snowpack event in the northern Rockies, it's followed by low snowpack in the southern Rockies or the upper Colorado. And this seems pretty consistent throughout the record. But it's worth taking a moment to say, well, is it always consistent, or do we have evidence of this changing such that you don't see a dipole all the time? And just to exemplify what this looks like, here's the end of the Little Ice Age as we know it, where we had high snowpack across the north and down into the transitional upper basins of the upper Colorado River Basin. These sometimes look like the north, sometimes look like the south. They're extremely hard to model because of that behavior, but a dry part of the lower basin. And then you switch to the first sort of bad drought across the northern regions, 1511 to 1530. You've got low snowpack across the north and a wet upper Colorado basin. This would exemplify a good El Nino event and what would make everybody in this room very happy. So did this function that way all the time? When you look at these records, pretty much with the exception of a brief period during the Dust Bowl, this big period after the 1980s, the only other time you see this breakdown of the dipole is the 1350s and especially the 1400s, which you would call the end of the medieval climate anomaly, or a period of time where we did have temperatures that were close to today but not nearly as warm. So in one way, we put forward in that paper that this may well reflect, especially that magnitude of the post-1980s decline, recent non-stationarity or this growing impact of temperature on snowpack that, with continued warming, we expect to continue on, which is what's synchronizing western snowpack. Not the failure of precipitation, because again, if you're not getting it down here, we're typically getting the precipitation across the north. But we can't just rest on our laurels. We needed to kick that idea around more. So here we use just gridded observational climate data through a simple temperature index snow model to basically look at this question. Was it temp or was it precipitation that caused the declines in the 30s versus the post-1980s period? And we did this with a snow model because you can explicitly, after modeling snow, back out that causation, temp versus precip, much more than you can with the tree ring record. So here we use those same regions. The boxes show you where we use the gridded climate data in the north and the south. We've truncated this middle region because, again, it's transitional between the north and the south. And the snow model's in black here now, compared to the tree rings in red and the observational snow course records in blue. And you can tell here from both regions, all those records are producing a very similar story. Here's your really wet 1922 Colorado River compact era that the model's showing extremely wet conditions down into the 1930s, and here's today, our post-1980s record. So, when we back out those forcings now of this model and say what generated those big snowpack events, this is a lot to look at, but when you see that red line, these red bars above the mean line here, that's showing the effect of cool springs contributing to high snowpacks. And when it's below, it's warm springs contributing to low snowpacks. And the blue basically shows you winter and spring precipitation. So what you can see here, take our 1930s drought, that's pretty much a failure across the West of precipitation. Our pre-Colorado compact area, this is one of the reasons why it's so rare to see high snow events like this. You had the combination of winter and spring temperatures being cool with high winter and spring precipitation leading to this huge blip, which you only see something similar to it in the early 80s when the dams were about to be overtopped again. Before we take this big slide down, rapid warming across the region, both in the spring and the winter, which basically has been what's undercutting snowpack on top of average to below average precipitation since the early 80s. So temperature is a big player, and it's growing in importance. And again, I think these graphs show that growth and importance pretty well. And on top of being able to model the amount of snowpack in terms of water equivalent across the West, we could also look at snow cover. And I just want to point out that across both regions, the low to middle elevations have shown the worst effects of snow cover as measured by April 1, where we see 20% declines basically above any area that's warmer than a degree C by February and March has seen a 20% decline. The northern Rockies has also seen it in their higher elevations, but you can tell here your higher, cooler elevations, at least according to the model, which is not necessarily reality, shows that snow should be hanging on there pretty well, but I think Chris Landry has something to say about dust on snow and what might actually be happening at those high elevations there, rather than what this model spit out. So just to quickly sort of summarize, important things, we have both high interannual and high decadal scale variability in the position of the storm track. Who's getting moisture and who's not getting moisture. It's a big forcing, and this is one of the big lessons out of paleoclimate. You can be stuck in a dry or wet period for decades at a time, and it's not necessarily related to the human influence on climate change. That's just the way the climate system operates. It tends to get stuck in one mode or another for a lot of reasons we don't completely understand. Also, elevation and average temperature are basically key controls on historical snowpack variability. Like I say, the northern Rocky Mountains showed that in the entire upper Columbia Basin. And I think that synchronous declines across the West we're seeing today tell this story well. And as we all know in this room, snowpack is a critical control on stream flow, fire activity, glacial dynamics, in conjunction with what happens in our summer times. And basically that historic north-south stationary dipole is basically only shown to break down, other than the post-1980 periods, with 2 periods of documented elevated warmth in the past. So I think it's the records are all pointing to the fact that temperature is a big player in what happens with our snow and our cryosphere. And for all of us in this room, it really harkens a new era of continued west-wide snowpack declines. Basically, earlier peak stream flows and reduced summer flows, and a longer dry season we're possibly looking at managing through. Down here, a big unknown is also what happens with the summer monsoons. Are you going to be getting hosed like you're unfortunately getting hosed today, which is not necessarily a monsoon event? But what role might the monsoon play in the future with filling reservoirs versus our winter snowpack and free storage that comes from that? And the big implications really are the post-1980s synchronous snowpack declines may be the inflection point for a new era of non-stationarity in western water resources, or that growing influence of temperature. And the last few decades likely signal that shift of precipitation to temperatures becoming a larger or even dominant influence on snow in the regions. And basically, increased warming will likely continue to modify our annual hydrograph stream temperatures, both altering our aquatic habitats and basically challenging all our water managers in this room, especially when you add that growth in human population to the record, which is really an important part, because there's a lot of water in these basins, but we all now have a lot of people that need that water, and that's just as critical as what's happening climatically. So with that, I will thankfully be quiet, I think, for all of you now, and take any questions you may have.
Thank you. What effect do you think that the forest fires of the last few years have had on our climate and our moisture content?
The question for those in the audience is, what effect do you think the fires of the last few years or decades have had on our moisture content? And that's actually a complex question to answer, because it depends on the basin, and it also depends on the time frames you're looking at. When you initially have a forest fire run through a basin, in most cases, especially when you're talking about basins that point northward rather than southwards, it enhances snow capture and retention, and also increases runoff because you don't have all those trees pumping moisture out through evapotranspiration. And that works for all the studies I've seen, typically 3 to 5 years or so before you get that regrowth and the dog hair coming in, and those trees very rapidly start taking up that moisture again and sort of pulling out of that available stream for the water system. So that's the sort of effect on moistures. As for effect on climate, that's an even tougher one. Overall climate, it's certainly contributing to growing carbon in the atmosphere, but that carbon's always been part of that biological carbon cycle, whereas the real overload in the atmosphere is coming from the burning of fossilized carbon. So.
I have a question. Could you remind me at least from your slide, I know there's lots of variables affecting this issue, but when might we recycle out this, or what are some of the other periods or the history that were maybe this long, and when things recycle to a better time?
The duration of drought events is always variable. And we know, again, sort of, let me get back to that comparison with the upper Colorado. There it is. So it does and it will continue to bounce around, I'm sure, unless we get a total dynamic response where you get a blocking of winter precipitation across the Southwest, which I don't think is necessarily as likely as it sometimes is said to be, but it certainly could be. What you oftentimes see are drought events that can easily last 10 to 12 years. Beyond 10 to 12 years, they become less frequent, but there are big ones like, this is, I think, a sum total of 75 years of sustained low flows reconstructed on the upper Colorado. The 1550s to 1600 drought is 50 years. So from natural causes alone, the region could certainly be stuck in an extremely long, extended dry period. I don't think we have any indication necessarily, other than what's coming out of the global climate modeling community that says intensification of the Hadley cells and their expansion may cause a blocking of winter precipitation and moisture, which may cause extended drought-like conditions across the Southwest. That certainly may be the case, but global climate models also don't do a very good job replicating natural variability, so I think it's always a big dog in the room that hopefully we'll see a return to a 10 or 20-year period at some point of high flows again.
Thank you for being here and for your presentation. It's really informative. I was wondering, you mentioned feedback loops, and what other types of feedback loops do you think will be affecting our climate in coming years?
That's a very good question. So yeah, feedback loops, and there are a lot of them, especially when it comes to the cryosphere. And I think in the cryosphere, we're likely to learn just as many surprises as we are what we already sort of have seen and understand. Things like dust on snow was kind of one of those big surprises, especially across the south-southwest. I don't think a lot of people were expecting as much transport of lower elevation soils up to those higher elevations, causing a large erosive or even sublimation effect on those snows. Another one is just simply the snow albedo effect, which we see that one as being a very pernicious change across the sort of upper Columbia and northern Rockies region, because once you take that white snow off the ground, basically that surface becomes black and you get basically a 50% greater heating capacity or load of that environment. So it takes your spring temperatures and it takes your melt-off rates and all the other processes that start once you remove snow, and it really speeds them all up. And that, I think, will continue to grow in importance as springs come earlier and earlier and the melt-out happens earlier and earlier. As for other feedbacks, I'd say those are the two big ones, along with forest and land cover change from what happens when you burn so much acreage. That does change hydrologic dynamics in a big way as well. But that's always a mixed story. Some places it results in lower snowpacks and less yield, but a lot of places you get higher yields. But it's always temporary till you get that forest back in there. So those are the big ones, and I think they'll remain big in the next 10 to 15 years, but I'm always surprised what we learn as time goes on. So.
Greg, I have one question also. Given that warm air carries more moisture, why does not a warming climate result in more precipitation?
Well, a warming climate, in a general sense, does result in more precipitation. For the process you're talking about right now. It tends to come in these more extreme events like we're seeing at the moment on the Front Range. But the big difference is, and especially as it relates to water resources, is also that form of that precipitation. You're talking about big storm events that typically come as rain. They're flashy. You get it's sort of that fire hose filling a wine glass effect, as I've heard it said before, where if you're looking to fill reservoirs or then manage the water, how do you balance flood control versus filling a reservoir? Whereas snowpack is again, it's a free reservoir source that locks that snow up and typically melts it off slowly in the summertime. So with this new dynamic of a warmer atmosphere, which is not hospitable for snow accumulating on the landscape, and these larger storm and precip events, it basically means we're going to have to change the way we think about how we manage and produce the sort of water storage we need to get through those dry summers, and even in our longer dry summers, in addition to the sort of reservoirs we already have in place. So you can get an overall total increase in precipitation, but it's that utility of the precipitation towards our current water management infrastructure. And I think a lot of people are thinking about, well, how do we supplement or augment or come up with things like rainwater capture in city areas and reallocation on top of our big reservoir systems to get people through the dry season. So that might not have been as eloquently stated as I could have, but but I think it maybe gives the general idea. Thanks.
Other questions for Greg? We have plenty of time. If not, thanks for coming all the way down from Bozeman, Montana.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a beautiful place again.